Case 1. Ted Haggard. The shock began before dawn on a cold November morning in 2006, when the quiet streets surrounding Ted Haggard's Colorado Springs home erupted with reporters, cameras, and police vehicles. Inside the mansion, Haggard paced back and forth in a state of rising panic as national headlines exploded across every major outlet. A male escort had come forward, claiming he and one of America's most influential evangelical pastors had been involved in a hidden sexual relationship fueled by drugs. As the story spread, evangelical leaders scrambled behind closed doors, church members wept in disbelief, and political strategists watched in horror as a man who had shaped the moral voice of millions suddenly stood at the center of a scandal he could not outrun. The sense of betrayal was immediate, visceral, and overwhelming. For years, Haggard had spoken with thunderous authority about purity, discipline, and moral righteousness. Now, the facade was crumbling in real time, and the entire nation was watching. Long before the media firestorm, Ted Haggard had been a towering figure in American Christianity. He was the founding pastor of New Life Church, a megachurch that had become a spiritual empire in Colorado and a model of evangelical growth nationwide. His influence stretched all the way to the White House, where he advised presidents, shaped national conversations about marriage and morality, and positioned himself as a guardian of conservative Christian values. He preached with unwavering certainty about holiness, family, and sexual restraint, presenting himself as the embodiment of evangelical integrity. People trusted him because he seemed immovable, disciplined, focused, and perfectly aligned with the moral expectations he proclaimed. To the public eye, Ted Haggard was a man who had conquered every temptation and lived far above the struggles of the average believer. But behind the sermons and the political power, another life existed, one Haggard fought desperately to conceal. While he delivered fiery messages condemning sexual sin, including repeated denunciations of same-sex relationships, he was privately communicating with a male escort in Denver. Their conversations, later revealed through phone recordings and testimony, included arrangements for meetings and discussions about crystal meth. The contrast between what he preached and what he practiced was stark. To the world, he insisted on purity and discipline. In private, he was unraveling under the weight of desires he publicly condemned and privately acted upon. The hypocrisy wasn't just damning, it was devastating. His congregation didn't merely lose trust, they felt deceived by a man who demanded honesty from them while living a carefully constructed lie. The scandal intensified as investigations unfolded. The escort provided detailed accounts of their encounters, including dates, locations, and the circumstances surrounding them. He produced voicemails, recordings of Haggard that matched his voice unmistakably. At first, Haggard denied everything. He stood before cameras insisting the accusations were fabrications, that he had never used drugs, and had never engaged in sexual misconduct. But as more evidence surfaced, the denials cracked. Within days, Haggard issued a written confession acknowledging that he had been guilty of sexual immorality. The admission sent shockwaves through New Life Church, where thousands gathered, stunned and silent, trying to process the collapse of the man they had trusted for decades. In one of the most dramatic falls from grace in modern evangelical history, Haggard was removed from all leadership roles, stripped of his pastoral authority, forced out of the organizations he once led, and placed under a restoration process that would ultimately sever him from the church he founded. The consequences were immense. New Life Church fractured under the weight of the scandal, with members leaving in waves and leadership scrambling to restore stability. The National Association of Evangelicals lost a president whose influence had shaped national policy debates, and across the country, millions who had looked to Haggard as a moral compass felt betrayed by the revelation that the man who preached purity with such force had been living in direct contradiction to his own message. His fall wasn't simply a personal failure. It was a public unmasking that exposed the fragile underbelly of evangelical celebrity culture, where image often eclipses integrity and where the pressure to appear morally flawless drives some leaders into secret lives that ultimately destroy them. Welcome to Savage Case Files. If you're drawn to deep-dive true crime documentaries, to stories where power, secrecy, and hidden lives collide in ways the public never saw coming, then you're in the right place. We release gripping investigations like this every single day, unpacking the scandals that shook entire congregations, toppled ministries, and exposed the people who preached one thing while living another. So, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are 9 more shocking cases ahead, and each one is more unbelievable than the last. Case 2. Eddie Long. The fallout from Ted Haggard's scandal was still echoing across the country when another earthquake hit the American church. And this one came out of Georgia, centered around one of the most recognizable pastors in the Black evangelical world. Eddie Long stood in the pulpit of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church like a king presiding over a spiritual empire. His tailored suits, sculpted physique, and booming baritone gave him a commanding presence, and his teachings on purity, masculinity, and obedience drew tens of thousands into his sanctuary every week. To many, he was the epitome of pastoral authority, strong, disciplined, morally unshakable. But beneath the perfectly pressed suits and polished sermons, a very different story was waiting to surface. The scandal began quietly, almost in a whisper, when a lawsuit was filed in 2010 by a young man who claimed Long had used his spiritual authority to manipulate him into a sexual relationship. Then a second young man came forward, then a third, then a fourth. Each accusation mirrored the others in painful detail, claims that Long provided special privileges, private trips, expensive gifts, hotel rooms, and late-night mentoring sessions that blurred the line between pastoral guidance and something far more personal. They allege that he introduced these encounters as covenants, spiritual bonds that required secrecy, loyalty, and obedience, and all of it stood in direct contradiction to the purity and heterosexual moral discipline he demanded from his congregation. Once the accusations hit the media, New Birth became the center of a national firestorm. Cameras camped outside the megachurch as journalists scrambled to understand how a man so outspoken about sexual morality could now be facing allegations that struck at the very foundation of his message. Congregants cried on the steps, torn between the spiritual father they had trusted and the disturbing details emerging in the lawsuits. Critics demanded accountability. Supporters insisted it was a coordinated attack. And Eddie Long himself stood before a packed sanctuary, not with a confession and not with a clear denial, but with a cryptic statement. "I am not a perfect man, but I am going to fight this." The legal battle that followed never reached the clarity the public demanded, because Long ultimately settled the lawsuits out of court, privately, quietly, and without admission of guilt. No definitive resolution ever emerged. But the damage was irreversible. The settlement, the secrecy, and the refusal to go to trial left a cloud over his ministry that never lifted. Attendance at New Birth plummeted as members struggled to reconcile the man they heard preach every Sunday with the behavior described by the young men he once mentored. For many, it was not only a scandal but a spiritual trauma, an unraveling of trust in a leader who had shaped their beliefs about holiness and sexual integrity. In the years that followed, Eddie Long grew increasingly withdrawn from public life. His once powerful physical frame appeared frail, sparking rumors of illness. Though he continued preaching, the unshakable confidence that once defined him seemed dulled, shadowed by a past he could never fully outrun. When he died in 2017, a portion of the Christian community mourned a charismatic and influential leader, but others remembered the unresolved pain, the unanswered questions, and the young men whose accusations had reshaped his legacy forever. Eddie Long's downfall wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. A stark reminder of what happens when a preacher builds a ministry on purity, authority, and discipline, only to fall in the very area where he demanded the strictest obedience. Case 3. Paul Cain. The shock surrounding Paul Cain wasn't just about the accusations, it was about who people believed he was. For decades, Cain had been revered as the embodiment of prophetic purity. He carried himself with a gentle, almost monastic restraint, speaking softly about holiness, obedience, and the sacred responsibility of spiritual leadership. Entire movements within the charismatic world pointed to him as the example of a man untouched by the usual corruption that plagued celebrity preachers. He often spoke of lifelong celibacy, framing it as a divine calling that elevated him above ordinary struggles. To those who followed him, Cain seemed like an untouchable spiritual giant, someone whose moral authority felt unquestionable. But beneath the surface of that carefully constructed image, a very different story was unfolding. Whispered rumors had circled around him for years, quiet conversations among leaders, vague statements about concerns and patterns, subtle distancing from those who had previously celebrated him on international stages. Most dismissed it. After all, Paul Cain had become almost mythic. He was too revered, too connected, too spiritually pure to fall into scandal. His prophetic accuracy, his supposed supernatural encounters, and his status as a bridge between the old healing revivals and the modern prophetic movement made him seem beyond the reach of ordinary temptation. Then, the facade cracked. What started as murmurs behind closed doors erupted into full exposure when ministry leaders from the revival movements he helped shape confronted him with years of evidence. Accounts from young men, testimonies about inappropriate behavior, and details of secretive meetings that stood in stark contrast to his public vow of purity. Alongside the sexual misconduct came another revelation. A long-hidden battle with alcoholism that directly contradicted his claims of disciplined holiness. The downfall wasn't theatrical or explosive, it was slow, heartbreaking, and heavy, the kind of collapse that left people stunned into silence. When the truth finally came out, Cain didn't offer complicated explanations or attempt to blame anyone else. In a trembling, painful public confession, he admitted to the misconduct and acknowledged the years of deception. He submitted to ministry discipline, stepping away from platforms and influence. But for many who had built their own ministries on his prophetic legacy, the damage was irreversible. The man they had pointed to as a model of supernatural purity had been hiding the very sins he warned others to flee. The betrayal stung deeply, not only because of the scandal itself, but because it shattered the illusion that spiritual celebrity equaled moral invincibility. Even after the confession, the shockwaves continued to spread. Churches that had used Cain's prophecies to guide major decisions faced public questioning. Leaders who once celebrated him found themselves defending why they had ignored warning signs. Followers who saw him as a spiritual father were left wrestling with anger, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. And though Cain attempted to re-engage in ministry in later years, his legacy never recovered. The purity movement that had held him up as its champion quietly erased his name, and the prophetic world that once treated him like royalty distanced itself with careful, embarrassed silence. In the end, Paul Cain's story became a cautionary tale about the danger of elevating spiritual leaders to superhuman levels, because when they fall, they don't fall alone. His influence, once so revered, now carries a permanent stain, and the purity he preached with such conviction became the very arena where his deepest contradictions were exposed. Case 4. Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie Frisbee's chapter doesn't ease the viewer in, it drops them straight into the chaotic beauty of the 1970s Jesus movement, where barefoot hippies flooded beaches, parks, and makeshift revival tents looking for spiritual awakening. At the center of it all stood Lonnie, a magnetic young evangelist with long blonde hair, radiant eyes, and a presence that could ignite a crowd the moment he opened his mouth. To many, he was the face of a new Christian revolution, a man whose raw charisma and emotional intensity sparked spontaneous baptisms, mass conversions, and the fiery spiritual atmosphere that later shaped Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard movement. Pastors called him anointed. Followers called him a prophet. Some even whispered that he was the closest thing they had seen to the biblical apostles. His life became the proof that a counterculture hippie could be reborn into a voice of purity and revival. But behind the scenes, Lonnie carried a weight that no amount of praise could erase. He had spent much of his youth living in communes and drifting through the darker corners of California's underground scene. Even after stepping into ministry, he struggled with parts of himself he never fully resolved. Late at night, away from the crowds he inspired, Lonnie inhabited a silent double life, one filled with hidden relationships with men and secret battles with identity, shame, and trauma. And while he preached purity, repentance, and spiritual renewal, he felt trapped between the expectations placed on him by a movement desperate for heroes and the unresolved wounds he never dared to publicly name. As the revival exploded, so did scrutiny. Leadership figures grew uneasy with rumors surrounding Lonnie's private life, something he was terrified to discuss but unable to suppress. The more influence he gained, the more pressure mounted for him to embody perfect holiness. Eventually, whispers turned to investigations. The truth of his hidden relationships slipped into the open, and once it did, the institutions he helped build distanced themselves abruptly. His name vanished from official histories. Sermons he inspired went uncredited. Leaders who once depended on his anointing quietly rewrote the movement's origin story without him. Lonnie's downfall wasn't marked by a single headline or a courtroom revelation. It was quieter, more painful. A slow unraveling of relationships as churches moved to protect their reputations. He left the spotlight and drifted through ministries, battling addiction, homelessness, and broken trust. By the time the truth of his life began surfacing through books and documentaries after his death, the contrast was undeniable. The same man who preached spiritual purity and sparked national revival had lived engulfed in personal turmoil he felt he could never confess. In the end, Lonnie Frisbee's story became both an inspiration and a tragedy. He was a revivalist whose impact on American Christianity is immeasurable, yet his hidden struggles created fractures that ultimately eroded his ministry and reputation. His death in 1993 reopened questions the church had avoided for years, questions about authenticity, secrecy, and the crushing weight placed on spiritual leaders who silently fight battles behind the pulpit. His legacy remains complicated, powerful, and deeply human, the story of a man who helped birth a movement while hiding the secrets that would one day shake it. Case 5. Bishop Thomas Weeks. The unraveling of Bishop Thomas Weeks began quietly, whispers, rumors, and unanswered questions circulating long after his very public divorce from Juanita Bynum had already dominated national headlines. For years, Weeks had worked to rebuild his reputation, rebrand his ministry, and present himself as a man restored, redeemed, and recommitted to a clean, righteous life. But beneath the polished sermons and renewed public persona, another storm was forming. One that would shake the fragile foundation of his ministry all over again. This time, the controversy centered not on marital conflict, but on reports and allegations tying him to relationships with male partners. Accusations that spread quickly through blogs, church gossip circles, and media outlets hungry for the next twist in the already dramatic saga of a pastor who preached holiness but could not escape continuous scandal. As the chatter intensified, Weeks found himself once again thrust into a spotlight he didn't control. What made this scandal hit harder was the contrast between his message and the accusations. Weeks had spent years teaching about moral order, divine alignment, and the sanctity of marriage, sculpting an image rooted in spiritual authority. But the emerging controversies painted a far different picture, one that raised questions about secrecy, authenticity, and the private life behind his public preaching. He denied many of the claims, pushing back against the narratives forming around him, yet the damage was already well underway. For countless observers, the issue was less about the details and more about the recurring pattern. Another high-profile preacher whose moral branding did not match the reality unfolding behind closed doors. The fallout was swift and costly. Congregants left, citing exhaustion from the endless stream of headlines. Supporters struggled to reconcile the man they admired with the stories filling the news. And Week's ministry, already bruised from past controversies, absorbed yet another blow, reinforcing the painful truth running through this entire series. When the public image of purity collapses, it rarely does so quietly. Case 6. Jim Swilley. Long before his announcement made national headlines, Jim Swilley had built his ministry on a foundation of confident preaching, charismatic leadership, and a polished image of traditional evangelical stability. Thousands saw him as the steady, commanding voice of a thriving Georgia megachurch, a pastor whose sermons blended emotional warmth with uncompromising moral clarity. But beneath the surface, a storm had been gathering for years. Rumors about his private life circulated in hushed conversations, whispered online threads, and tense church hallways, all met with public silence from Swilley himself. Nothing concrete ever emerged. Until the day he chose to confront the truth head-on. The turning point came during a deeply personal, vulnerable video address recorded at his church. With congregants filling the sanctuary and cameras rolling, Swilley's voice trembled as he revealed that he was gay, something he said he had wrestled with his entire life, something he had hidden to protect his church, his family, and his own sanity. He spoke of years spent in internal conflict, of the emotional toll of maintaining an identity that wasn't his truth, and of the pain caused by decades of secrecy. In a single moment, the facade that many had clung to shattered, not because he had been caught in scandal, but because he was finally stepping into honesty after years of public expectations and private torment. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Supporters around the world praised his courage, calling the confession brave and long overdue. But inside his congregation, the atmosphere was different. Shock rippled through the pews. Some members wept openly. Others walked out before he finished speaking. Local and national media outlets descended on the story, turning Swilley into a lightning rod for debates about sexuality and faith within the evangelical world. For many longtime congregants, the revelation felt like betrayal. They had trusted the image he upheld, the traditional family structure he modeled, the teachings he delivered, all of which now felt, to them, destabilized. Behind the scenes, the consequences unfolded with quiet severity. Membership declined sharply, leadership shifted, families who had once worshipped together split along ideological lines, and the church that Swilley had built over decades experienced a fracture from which it never fully recovered. Though he remained in ministry, the weight of public scrutiny and internal division dramatically altered the trajectory of both his career and his congregation. Yet what made Swilley's story so shocking wasn't criminal behavior or hidden victims. It was the collision between public expectation and private truth. For an evangelical community that had long condemned same-sex relationships, his coming out wasn't merely controversial, it was seismic. It forced uncomfortable conversations, challenged deeply rooted doctrines, and exposed the enormous emotional toll borne by leaders who feel compelled to hide parts of themselves to fit within a culture that demands unwavering conformity. In the end, Jim Swilley's scandal wasn't about hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It was about the breaking of a narrative, one that bound him for decades and shaped the identity of an entire congregation. And as the dust settled, one fact remained painfully clear. The fallout from his revelation permanently reshaped both his ministry and the community that once followed him without question. Case 7. Carlton Pearson. Carlton Pearson had once been one of the most magnetic and respected preachers of his era, a rising star within the Pentecostal movement, a man who filled arenas, advised national leaders, and commanded the type of spiritual authority that few pastors ever truly reach. His charisma was undeniable, and his voice carried the weight of certainty when he preached about holiness, purity, and moral discipline. But long before his doctrine shifted into the controversial teachings that would one day divide the evangelical world, there were quieter confessions buried in his early years, private admissions about same-sex encounters and hidden struggles that clashed violently with the moral image he projected. Though not criminal, those revelations became part of the broader storm that eventually engulfed his ministry, intensifying the scrutiny around a man already walking a tightrope between public reverence and private turmoil. The tension in Pearson's life always seemed to revolve around image, how he was seen, what he represented, and the standards he demanded from others. He wasn't merely a preacher who talked about holiness, he embodied it, at least in the eyes of his followers. He presented himself as a leader untouched by scandal, a guardian of purity in a world he believed was drowning in moral confusion. His voice thundered in conventions, revivals, and international conferences as he called Christians to rise above temptations and fleshly desires. So when he spoke in later years, during interviews and televised conversations, about youthful same-sex experiences that haunted him throughout his early ministry, people found themselves wrestling with a different version of Pearson, one far more complicated than the hero many had built him up to be. These admissions didn't stand alone. They fed into an already growing skepticism surrounding his evolving theology. By the time his statements became part of the national conversation, Pearson had already stepped into controversy for preaching what he called the gospel of inclusion, a message that shook traditional Pentecostal foundations. But the added layer of early leaf sexual struggles amplified the backlash. Religious leaders used it as ammunition, critics called him compromised, and people who once considered him a spiritual pillar began distancing themselves, convinced that his moral authority had been fractured from the start. The narrative shifted almost overnight. Instead of seeing him as a groundbreaking thinker wrestling with theology, many saw him as a man whose private contradictions eventually spilled into public controversy. What made the fallout more painful was that Pearson never seemed to dodge the truth. He spoke openly about the internal battles he had faced, the guilt that consumed him, and the fear that confession might destroy everything he had built. And in a way, it did. Churches withdrew support. Networks cut ties. His once thriving ministry withered under pressure from leaders who insisted he had betrayed the moral purity he once preached so passionately. Even though his experiences were not crimes, the mere acknowledgement of them became a spark that ignited years of criticism, gossip, and judgment. Yet through all of it, Pearson never retreated. He continued preaching, continued teaching, continued evolving, determined to redefine himself beyond the labels others placed on him. But there's no denying that the revelation of his past, combined with his doctrinal shift, carved a lasting mark into his legacy. It became part of the story people whispered about, part of the reason many claimed his ministry had fallen from grace, part of the complex portrait of a man who lived in the crossfire of expectation and humanity. For followers who once believed he embodied the pinnacle of spiritual purity, the contradiction was devastating. For critics, it was vindication, and for the wider public, it served as yet another reminder that even the most polished voices in the pulpit carry private battles. And sometimes, those battles refuse to stay hidden forever. Case 8. Father Walter Cuenin. The unfolding case of Father Walter Cuenin has sent a fresh wave of shock through Boston's Catholic community as a civil lawsuit, recently filed and now making headlines, alleges that the once celebrated priest engaged in sexual misconduct with a male college student decades ago. The story resurfaced with force as national outlets began reporting on the suit, outlining a disturbing account of a young man who says he was manipulated during a vulnerable period of his life. For years, Father Cuenin had been viewed as a reform-minded priest, someone known for compassion, activism, and community outreach. He was the last person many parishioners ever imagined would be linked to such an allegation, which only deepens the sense of betrayal. According to the lawsuit, the plaintiff describes being drawn into Cuenin's orbit as a student seeking spiritual guidance. What allegedly began as mentorship evolved into moments the young man says crossed boundaries, blurred lines, and eventually became outright sexual misconduct. The filing portrays a dynamic shaped by Cuenin's spiritual authority, the psychological weight of religious mentorship, and the power imbalance between a respected priest and a young man unsure how to resist. As reporters began covering the case, most notably the New York Post and other large outlets, Cuenin's legacy shifted overnight from respected cleric to the center of a public legal battle. Because the lawsuit is active, the church's response has been measured, offering acknowledgement of the claim but withholding definitive statements while litigation proceeds. Still, the fallout is immediate. Parishioners shaken, past supporters questioning everything they believed about his moral leadership, and a community once again confronting the painful intersection of faith, trust, and alleged abuse. Whether the courts ultimately confirm or dismiss the accusations, the damage to Cuenin's reputation is already unmistakable, casting a long shadow over his years of ministry and forcing yet another congregation to reckon with the consequences of a leader's alleged misconduct. Case 9. Theodore Ted McCarrick. The unraveling of Theodore McCarrick's legacy began not with a single explosive headline, but with a slow, gathering storm of whispers that had circulated for decades through seminaries, rectories, and church corridors. For years, he was the polished face of American Catholic leadership, an influential cardinal, a global diplomat, a fundraiser trusted by popes, and a spiritual authority whose public image radiated discipline, wisdom, and moral certainty. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, multiple seminarians later described a very different world. One where McCarrick allegedly used his authority to blur boundaries, manipulate spiritual language, and coerce adult men who relied on him for guidance, approval, and advancement. The allegations spoke of private beach houses where young seminarians felt pressured to share a bed with him, of whispered conversations framed as fatherly affection, and of spiritual mentorship twisted into something far more disturbing. For years, those stories stayed buried under institutional silence. But in 2018, the New York Times published a sweeping investigation revealing that accusations against McCarrick had been quietly handled, dismissed, or minimized for decades. Soon after, the dam finally broke. More seminarians came forward, describing long-term patterns of misconduct, while a separate allegation involving a minor triggered an immediate crisis for the Vatican. Church investigators launched a formal canonical process that unearthed a trail of documented complaints, internal letters, and warnings that had circulated for years without meaningful intervention. The consequences were earth-shaking. McCarrick became the first U.S. cardinal in history to be removed from the clerical state, a rare and devastating ecclesiastical penalty that signaled the magnitude of the findings against him. His fall shattered the trust of Catholics worldwide, exposed deep systemic failures within church leadership, and forced uncomfortable conversations about how spiritual authority can be manipulated behind closed doors when accountability is absent. Case 10. Clarence McClendon. The scandal surrounding Clarence McClendon didn't erupt in one explosive headline the way some others did. It simmered, grew, and eventually spilled into public consciousness through a combination of whispered allegations, media reports, and the unmistakable tension of a pastor trying to maintain an image of spiritual authority while rumors of inappropriate relationships with men gathered like storm clouds around his ministry. McClendon had spent years cultivating a persona built on polished preaching, musical charisma, and an aesthetic of excellence that made his services feel like high-production events. His image was intentional, a leader anointed, prosperous, chosen. But behind the immaculate suits and practiced sermons, accusations began to leak into the public conversation, painting a far more complicated reality. Reporters and bloggers started picking up early stories, former members hinting at inappropriate conduct, others alleging private relationships that contradicted the pastor's public teachings on holiness and morality. The accusations weren't criminally prosecuted, but they carried enough weight and enough consistency that they quickly ignited widespread debate. Each new allegation intensified the sense of disillusionment among those who had once viewed McClendon as a beacon of divine excellence. For many of his congregants, the rumors cut deeper than simple moral failure. They represented a breach of trust from a leader who preached purity, obedience, and unwavering discipline, while allegedly living outside the boundaries he set for everyone else. As the media pressure mounted, McClendon responded with defiance, insisting the accusations were born out of jealousy, spiritual attack, or personal vendettas. Yet, even as he defended himself, the damage spread. The public didn't just see a minister under scrutiny, they saw a pattern that mirrored countless other scandals in the religious world. Power creating protection, charisma overshadowing accountability, and image taking precedence over integrity. Discussions about the allegations erupted across Christian forums, news sites, and even secular outlets, all pointing to the same painful truth. His once glittering ministry was now overshadowed by questions of hypocrisy and hidden behavior. The fallout was unmistakable. Attendance dropped. Longtime supporters quietly drifted away. Ministry partnerships dissolved. What hurt most, for many, wasn't the scandal itself, but the profound sense of betrayal. McClendon had been a symbol of spiritual strength, someone who demanded moral rigor from his followers while allegedly failing to uphold it himself. And while he was never convicted of any crime, the public nature of the accusations ensured his reputation never fully recovered. In the end, Clarence McClendon's story sits at the intersection of charisma, influence, and the relentless pressure of public ministry. His downfall didn't come from a courtroom verdict. It came from the steady erosion of trust, the accumulation of allegations, and the painfully familiar realization that a preacher who spoke so passionately about holiness may not have been living anything close to what he preached. As these 10 stories come to an end, a sobering pattern emerges, one that stretches across denominations, movements, and generations. Each of these pastors stood before their congregations as moral authorities, preaching purity, self-discipline, and spiritual obedience. Yet behind the pulpits, in hidden hotel rooms, quiet offices, and private conversations, entirely different lives were unfolding. The devastation that followed wasn't just the collapse of careers or the exposure of double lives, it was the emotional and spiritual wreckage left in their wake. Congregations splintered, survivors spoke out after years of silence, and communities were forced to confront the painful truth that the people who claimed to guide them toward righteousness were wrestling with the very sins they condemned. When leaders fall, it's never just a personal downfall. It becomes a collective heartbreak, a rupture in trust that can take decades to mend. And as each scandal rippled outward, it reignited a question believers have struggled with for centuries. How do you separate the message from the messenger, especially when the messenger uses faith as a mask? But now I want to hear from you. Out of all 10 cases, which one shocked you the most, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about it.